name is Maureen Black, and I'm going to answer 4 questions that were raised in the chat. The first question has to do with weaning, and apparently I referred to traditional weaning, and the question is, what is traditional weaning? I would say if you really consider traditional, then it may vary tremendously by cultures. For the most part, weaning refers to the transition from a liquid diet, which is often a diet that is exclusively breast milk, to a diet that has some texture and introduces other nutrients. So it's often a puree, something that is softened, and the means that it is given to a child is often through a spoon. It varies by cultures. In some cultures, it's a soup, and in some cultures, it's very softened food. The next question, actually, there are several questions that had to do with baby-led weaning. So I'll talk a little bit about what baby-led weaning is and my interpretation of how it can be used. I say that with an understanding that there are those who prescribe or discuss baby-led weaning in a slightly different form than I'm talking about. I'm talking about enabling the child to do some self-feeding. So when I think about the baby-led weaning that I've had either experience with clinically or that I've read about, it starts in the second 6 months of life, 6 to 8 months, depending on the child's oral motor skills and hand skills and interest. But what it is giving the baby food that she or he can feed independently. That a primary consideration is that the food be soft so that there's not a chance of choking. Babies at this age do not have good hand skills, and their oral motor skills are emerging. When I say they don't have good hand skills, they typically cannot do a pincer grasp. So they're using a rake grasp, meaning that they're using all of their fingers and partial thumb opposition to pick things up. So it's a messy time that they're using to eat. One of the questions had to do with the advantages and disadvantages of baby-led weaning or self-feeding at this time. An advantage has to do with the independence, that a child is then engaged. Remember, again, this is at 6 to about 12 months. A child at that age is typically interested in what's going on around him or her. By having the food on a tray in front of the child focuses on the food and on bringing the food to her mouth. It's work, so the infant has to be working at it and is typically very concentrated on picking up, finding the food and picking it up. So it promotes independence for the child. It also builds motor skills for the child. And if the child then is very focused on getting the food and on eating rather than focused on other things. So that's a big advantage. And another big advantage is the regulatory process. The child is then regulating how much they're eating. And the child is deciding that I've had enough, I'm stopping, I'm continuing. So it's enabling the child to exercise her emerging regulatory skills. The concerns or the disadvantage of it, I mentioned choking. Another one is, does the child get enough food, and does the child get enough of a variety of foods? That's where the caregiver in this situation is not totally independent, But typically this kind of feeding, baby-led weaning, or the child self-feeding takes place in the context of others eating. So a caregiver is monitoring what the child is eating and ensuring that the child is safe, and ensuring that there is variety, and that the child is eating. I the As I read about baby-led weaning, I would say that I am not a purist, in that this is also a phase where there may be some spoon feeding, and there may be a 2-spoon method. 2 spoons means that the baby has a spoon and the caregiver has a spoon. The baby is learning to use the spoon and not going to be very skilled at doing it. The caregiver will be more skilled, but the baby then has the feeling of having done it themselves. So that can also be a helpful strategy that is building independence in eating. The sort of final comment, as I said, it often takes place in the context of a meal, and the food that's given is often similar to the family diet, just softened by being steamed or ground, or a method that the baby can handle. Okay, the next questions asked about neophobia. So neophobia, as we talked about, is the hesitation to try new foods. It's a normal developmental progression, and it makes sense as a child is being exposed to new foods. The way that what the evidence will tell us is that by presenting the food multiple times, that it becomes less novel and the child is more likely to eat it or to try it. Along with that is modeling the food, meaning that others are eating the food and looking as though they're enjoying it. So this again is a plug for meals for young children, being in a family context where children are able to watch others eating and others are watching them. Children want to do what they see, and they're more likely to do something and try something if they see others doing it or trying it. So those are generally the best strategies for dealing with neophobia. What one should not do is pressure the child and make a situation be conflictual or tense or stressful. That's going in the wrong direction. The next question had to do with failure to thrive. It's a 2-part question. The first part asked, what did I think about the term failure to thrive? Well, I will tell you that it is a pejorative term. It's because it pushes back on a caregiver with the word failure paired with the word thrive. So often what we use instead are other terms such as sometimes we say growth delay. But failure to thrive it's a very medicalized term, and it's often used in a medical sense. The other difficulty with it is there's not a precise definition for failure to thrive. Some will say that it is crossing 2 centiles in weight for age, but it really varies. So it's not a very clear definition on how it's used. What to do about it is that typically when you're in a very medical environment and you have to come up with a diagnosis, that is a diagnosis that is often listed. In working with families, I typically don't use the failure to thrive, but instead help families be able to interpret growth curves. And I will tell you that we focus much more on developing healthy habits around eating than essentially focusing exclusively on a growth curve. The second part of that question had to do with pickiness and neophobia. What can happen is you can find a child who is picky, that means hesitant about different kinds of foods or only eats selected foods, or a child who is neophobic. You can find that in a child who is underweight, a child who is adequate weight, and a child who is overweight. So those kinds of behaviors can be associated with different weight statuses of children. And you can understand an example that a child who is picky or neophobic may refuse to eat, and if they consistently refuse to eat, they may be underweight. Or you can see that a child who is selective may eat enough that their growth is all right. It's not hindering their growth. Or you could see that a child who doesn't eat, the parent compensates by giving them foods that they will eat, and that they overeat those foods and become overweight. So they're not necessarily associated. So I thank you for your interest and wish you the best.
Hello, everyone. Some questions that were not answered in the live question, I think they are very important. We will begin with one that I think is very important to be discussed, showing that studies that obesity also correlated with micronutrients deficiency as well as malnutrition. Uh, are there any differences on the way that we are treating them? I think we have to answer that, saying that probably there is a spectrum from undernutrition to the most severe obesity, and some questions are very similar. They are having restricted diets, they are eating some selective foods, they are restricting food groups, and we know that the people who are obese or very malnourished, they do have some problems in eating fruit, vegetables. Sometimes they do prefer milk or they do not eat meat at all. So iron, zinc, copper are the most common mineral deficiency, as well as calcium. And we have also to know that vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E are very important in some places and some of the issues that must be treated. So I think the way that we are treating them based on the deficiency is to supplement them, is to have the adequate micronutrient intake, and also we have to prevent the situation as soon as possible. The other question is, if a child have nutritional deficiency, which milk will be more suitable? This is a question from Dr. Motaleb. And I think it's very important that probably milk without any modification is not a very adequate source for micronutrient or nutritional deficiency. Is only a source for calcium and some very small parts of vitamins. Nonetheless, the supplementation or the fortification of milks or using of infant formula or follow-up formulas in some places could be very helpful in combating and preventing these deficiencies. So I think if possible, and if it is affordable and if it's accessible to everyone, I think a modified infant formula or a modified milk for follow-up is possible a way to tackle these deficiencies. Another question is, in Brazil, we do propose breastfeeding or formula supplementation from the second year of life to improve the programming period. I think it's not only for to improve the tracking that we have for combating or preventing obesity, it's also that we must have a very important complementary situation when we have breastfeeding for at least 6 months of age and an adequate complementary food. And if possible, keeping breastfeeding for as much as possible. And if not possible, we do substitute them for infant formula or adequate infant formula and not whole cow milk as it's used in our country. This is a way to prevent many deficiencies and also the exposure to obesity or overweight in the future. Other question is how to avoid vitamin D deficiency, especially in tropical countries. Is there any possibility of keeping only the amount of vitamin D that we have by sunbathing, or we do have to complement them with food? As we know, vitamin D has a double source of intake. So we do have to combine food intake and also sun exposure. We have to remember that some tropical countries like Brazil are very, very different in some places. Some latitude and longitude are very different in the way of we are exposed to sun. And we have places in the south that we have very small amounts of vitamin D, especially during winter. So we have to combine sun exposure, sun protection, and at the same time, we have to have adequate food intake, especially the sources that are not very common in the central part of some countries that are fish, fish oils, and other supplements. Many combined questions are regarding vegetarian or vegan diets. Some consequences on how to prevent deficiencies and how to cope with the way that the parents are using them, especially in the way of educating children from very early years. I think there is a wide array of possibilities of using a vegetarian diet. From one side, we have only a restriction of red meat. To the other side, we have a very strict diet with complete modifying of the diet based not only on the evitative way of using only vegetables, nuts, or seeds, and without any animal protein, but also with the philosophy involved that not using products that are derived from animal testing and other things. Every one of these diets have different consequences and different ways of preventing. If you have only a restriction of red meat or meat, you can of course, you can substitute them for all the animal proteins. And also it's very important that you have a lot of groups that are restricted, like berries and milk and other products and meat. We have a lot of possibilities of having iron anemia, deficiency of B12, B9, and other possible deficiencies at all. For the other side, we have many possibilities of preventing cardiovascular diseases, and also we have a possibility of reducing lipids and also cholesterol and triglycerides and other things like this. But if you have a very restrictive diet, you have to have someone who could be responsible for helping you in an adequate diet and a balanced diet, preventing deficiencies and also to prevent consequences in growth and immunity.
Well, hello everybody. My name is Andrew Prentice. I'm Professor of International Nutrition at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I direct the nutrition theme at the MRC unit in the Gambia in West Africa. It's my pleasure to record a few more answers to questions after the Nestle Nutrition Institute 95 webinars, which were sent in after that date. So the first question asks, ideally, diet should provide all nutrients needed for growth and development. If for any reason diet fails or is not enough, what would be the solutions? Fortification? So clearly this is a very deep and potentially long question to answer. So I'm going to avoid a very long answer. But yes, fortification is the kind of thing that we would try, and that can be divided into several different categories. We have centralized fortification, which governments might take on. That tends to be very targeted towards a number of nutrients. Classically, it would be vitamin A, iodine, and iron, which are the most common ones at the moment. Vitamin D in some foodstuffs in northern latitude countries. Point of care fortification in terms of sprinkles has been tried a great deal and can have an effect on benefiting micronutrient status for sure. The one I prefer most is the approach towards biofortification of crops. And this is quite, I have a suspicion that this question may come from Bangladesh. And biofortification is potentially very useful for countries such as Bangladesh, India, many countries of Africa. And the idea here is that we take crops that have been selected for very high levels of nutrients, iron, zinc, and vitamin A, again, are the ones that are prioritized. Now, it's important to emphasize that most of these have not been genetically modified. That's a separate issue, the genetically modified crops. But you can select through natural breeding processes the crops that have high nutrient contents. And what I love about this is that once those crops have been adopted by farmers, assuming, and they will only be adopted if they have very good agronomic conditions, traits, then they will continue to be grown. And so it's a self-sustaining intervention. And that's what why I'm so positive about biofortification of crops. The next question is, does dietary management of SAM, severe acute malnutrition, predispose to child obesity? Well, the first part of that answer should be it shouldn't. We very much hope it shouldn't. I think what the questioner might have in mind is that there has been evidence, in particular from Chile, where the country had some nationwide interventions to treat children with SAM. And these interventions got left in place for too long without the government and the interveners really noticing that actually these kids were becoming overweight. And certainly there was some evidence there that the unstinting application of that long-term countrywide intervention did create problems in terms of a leftover problem in terms of obesity. However, in most cases, treatment of SAM is generally a relatively short, sharp intervention to get the kid back on the road, back on the nutritional road, and it shouldn't be associated with later obesity. Having said that, there are some quite interesting studies that are looking into this and asking that question in more detail. So they're looking back, they're tracing children who were sufferers of severe acute malnutrition in childhood and following them up later, A, to measure their body composition, and B, to measure their metabolism. The results of those are somewhat mixed. Some of the studies are showing that there is indeed a predisposition to later obesity and to metabolic dysfunction. What one doesn't know is whether that is a cause of the treatment of the SAM itself, or even a third factor which is related to both of them independently. The next question says, Andrew, hygiene has impact on nutrition, so hand washing to maintain hygiene in a developing country like Bangladesh will improve nutritional status. Do you agree? Do you admit? The problem here, as I demonstrated, is that in theory that should be the case. We would very much hope that that would be the case. But the big wash and shine studies that have been implemented, including in Bangladesh, have sadly shown that it's very difficult to shift that needle. And that although the IYCF interventions, infant and young child feeding interventions in those big trials, were effective in getting children to grow a little bit better, not very, very much more better, but a little bit better, the wash interventions themselves were not effective. And this has really had everybody in the field scratching our heads and asking the question why. My own interpretation is that it's because the interventions didn't go far enough. You've really got to do far more than just washing hands in order to change the infection status of the child and the effect that will have on the environmental enteric disease and the damage to the gut. The next question is, Prof. Andrew, underweight and stunting, which one is more harmful? Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. And I think in a way I would kind of avoid an answer. I would say both are harmful. if caused by nutritional deficits. I want to remind you, of course, that there are perfectly reasonable physiological reasons that a person should be short or that a person should be skinny. If you look at me, you can probably see that I'm a very skinny kind of chap. That doesn't mean I'm undernourished by any means. I have plenty of food available, I eat a lot, but I'm a very skinny phenotype. And there are some children like that as well. So we need to sort that out, separate that out from our interpretation. What we tend to know is that a short-term period of being underweight, if not rectified quickly, will then lead to stunting. Now, both of them have sequelae. We know from data that they have immediate sequelae in terms of risk of death. If you look at data of children hospitalized, you see that those children who are underweight and or stunted are more likely to die, as well as that being the case in the community. The next question is stunting can be an effect for IQ? I think it's very important to say no here. Stunting does not itself lead to a diminished IQ. What may happen, and to some extent the data on this is still not as secure as we would like it to be, is that a poor diet that leads to stunting can also affect brain development and cause an impairment in IQ. However, it's perfectly possible also that the nature of the nutritional deficit might not prevent stunting, cause stunting rather, but could prevent a deficit in brain development. I take the example of iron, for instance. Iron is a nutrient which doesn't, if you're short of iron, it doesn't mean that you stop growing. What it means is that the tissue you do have on board is shorter, it has less iron available, and that could well affect the brain. So there is not a direct connection, and certainly not a causal one, between stunting and brain development and IQ. The next question is, I'm sure that you've all observed in which setting we consult here in Bangladesh. Do you think in this situation we can promote nutrition education? Well, yes. I mean, thank you for the question. Of course, we can promote nutrition education anywhere and everywhere. From the best nourished countries in the world, there's still a need for nutritional education. And I was talking to some of my students just earlier today who are medical students, as well as doing the nutrition course at the London School. And we were making the case that even in the medical curriculum, there isn't enough teaching of nutrition. So I think education. Let's try to teach it more widely. It's bound to be a good thing in the long term. The next question is there any research into predispositions as to whether maternal feeding pattern during pregnancy is correlative to weaning window and immunity of the baby? And the answer there is yes. Some interesting data, some of it coming from our own group, is showing that yes, you can have an effect in pregnancy, and it can have an effect on the baby's immune function. My colleague, Dr. Sophie Moore from King's College, showed with us in the Gambia that interventions in pregnancy can have a detectable effect on the thymic size of the offspring in the first year of life. Now, the thymus, of course, is the very important organ that helps to regulate T cell and B cell development and training and selection. And so, and there's good evidence that thymic size is related to survival to 1 year of age. So yes, we would agree that there is good evidence emerging that a mother's nutrition can have an effect on immunity as well as other growth factors. I guess we would say that we wish the effect was stronger than it is. It's not always very strong, and in some studies not detected. So we do wish there was a stronger relationship, but it is there. And the final question is, in Bangladesh, we have so many preterm low birth weight babies. How can we prevent this? I want to separate my answer into two bits, which are a little bit confused in this question. Preterm, they're not, I don't think in Bangladesh you necessarily, the data I've seen don't show necessarily that you have huge levels of preterm babies. They're not that different from other low-income countries. Unfortunately, the causes of preterm birth are many, and the solutions to this are really not yet known very well at all. There are various studies that show there are at least 10 different causes, and if one could attack each one of those causes, you might be able to have a little effect. So on balance, the evidence that we can change preterm birth much is really quite weak, and for nutrition to do that is not strong. We might be able to shift it by a couple of days. The other aspect, though, is low birth weight babies. Now, of course, you do in Bangladesh have large numbers of low birth weight babies, and this is very largely due to the fact that you have very small mothers. I remember coming to a field setting in Bangladesh, and we were visiting a field hospital, and I saw this three people. It was a mother, her mother, and a little tiny premature, low birth weight baby. And I rather cheekily asked if all three of them could be weighed. And so they weighed the mother, the grandmother, and the baby. And the total weight that they came to was less than my own body weight, which is not very big. So tiny mums, tiny grandmothers, and tiny babies as a consequence. The solution to that is patience. We have to wait, I think, for 1 or 2 generations for the population to gradually increase in size. And it would be inappropriate if a very tiny mum, say weighing 35 kgs or something, were to produce a 4.5 kilo baby. That would be a recipe for trouble. So we need to be patient and wait for these effects to be washed out from the community, maybe over 1 or 2 generations, with gradual progress in each generation. That would be my recipe for the best solution. So that's the end of the questions. Thank you very much for listening, if you have been, and we welcome to see you in future episodes of Nestlé Nutrition Institute webinars. Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to read some of these questions. I've got about 6 or 7 questions, and then I'll answer them immediately after each question. So the first question is the one that's come up many, many times, and is that in a pandemic situation, obesity increases. What can we do to avoid it, particularly because schools and colleges are closed? And my answer to that is actually the pandemic has made the underlying causes of obesity much worse. They've exaggerated the situation. So the same factors that caused obesity before the pandemic, such as poor diet and insufficient physical activity, have exaggerated in that time. For example, when it comes to diet, families are stressed, families don't have time to cook, they may have lost their jobs, there are financial implications, so they can't eat healthily. They may be eating more comfort food, for example, biscuits, and the sales of biscuits in this country have really shot up. When it comes to physical activity, they're not walking to school, they're not playing with their peers, they're not having any structured sports. So all of these factors can increase the risk of developing obesity in preschool children. And what can we do? I'm afraid it's the same things that we've been trying to do before the pandemic, but this time we have to try and make sure that we do as much of this as possible online. For example, we need to target our resources to low-income families, low social class families where the parents may have lost their jobs. We need to encourage physical activity using online tools which are available. And again, this depends on whether you have access to these tools. Okay, so next question is, I want to know about obesity. Is intake of micronutrient intake, does it increase the risk, and can supplementation prevent it? And that's relatively easy. I'm not aware of any micronutrient deficiencies that can increase the risk of developing obesity, and I'm not aware of any micronutrient supplementation that can help prevent it. That's not to say that micronutrient deficiencies are common in obese children. That is actually the case. The third question is, you mentioned that faster growth leads to obesity later in life. Is this only in children given formula milk? And does this milk mean that formula-fed children are more prone to obesity? Well, again, the evidence for that suggests that actually breastfed babies do have a lower risk of developing obesity. We don't know the cause of this. And one of the hypotheses that we've been working on is that the formula-fed babies grow too quickly, and as a result, they're programmed or influenced to have long-term risk of developing obesity. But it's not true to say that only formula-fed babies suffer from this implications of faster growth leading to obesity. And we're actually doing research in this area. And as a result of this, the protein content of formulas has actually fallen because we are now trying to mimic the growth rate of a breastfed baby in formula-fed infants. Next question is obesity due to genetic causes preventable? And that's a clearly yes. And the reason I can be so confident is that obesity has got worse over the last 30 to 40 years, but our genes haven't changed. So ultimately, you may have a genetic predisposition to becoming obese, but we know your environmental factors can overcome some of that genetic predisposition. So you can actually prevent genetic causes of obesity. It's much harder to do, particularly in monogenic forms of extreme obesity, but there are very, very, very few of these. So the question is school study burden responsible for obesity? And again, I'm sure I don't really have any evidence to say that how much studying children do makes any reference to the effect of obesity. Next question is, can child obesity be transmitted to other siblings in a family? And the word transmitted is probably not right. We know that obesity runs in families, children of low social class, low maternal education, other socioeconomic factors. People living in poorer areas all have a higher risk of developing obesity. So obesity is common in families, but in a way it's not transmitted unless you mean transmitted by your cultural and behavioral factors. Right. The next question, is there a relationship between obesity and IQ in children? And the answer to that is very clearly yes. There are many, many studies have shown that children who are obese also have lower IQ. And this is not just in children, it's seen in older children and in adults. The critical point here, that does not imply cause and effect. There's no real evidence to suggest that becoming obese affects your IQ. And we know this partly because of longitudinal studies. When you do follow-up studies, we know that children who become obese and they carry on obese and become more obese in children, there is an association between that obesity and IQ, but there isn't a decline in IQ over that period of time in those longitudinal studies. And we see these effects of obesity and IQ as early age of 3. So there's no direct evidence to suggest that obesity adversely affects IQ or cognitive development. That's not the same thing as academic achievement. We know that children who are obese have many medical problems, they have low socioeconomic circumstances, they have depression, stigmatizing, bullying, and all these factors may affect academic achievement. Academic achievement, although related to IQ, is not the same as IQ. And last question is, does restriction of cow's milk for toddlers, how can it be beneficial? Well, most regulatory bodies around the world, such as ESPGHAN and so on, we don't recommend cow's milk in the first year of life. And there are 2 reasons for this. First of all, it has a very low iron content, it causes macroscopic iron loss, and so it's detrimental to a baby's iron status. And the second reason is that actually cow's milk has very high levels of protein, and as I mentioned earlier, this is associated with faster infant growth and an increased risk of developing obesity. So there are 2 reasons why we avoid cow's milk in the first year of life, and some authorities, such as ESPGHAN, have said that we should actually be restricting this in later ages as well. So, for example, in the 2nd year of life, it's recommended that we have less than 500 mils of cow's milk per day in these babies. So I think that's all the questions that we've covered. Thank you very much.